know you and I have worked on projects together and independently of one another, even before working together on the third stage team. And one of the things that I know we've seen, on clients together, and I suspect you may have seen this in your past too, is that you get so enamored by technology oftentimes that the technology becomes the centerpiece instead of the operating model. And so that, that subtle nuance sort of changes the focus. I mean, what would you say to someone who's saying, well, why would we worry about our operating model? We're just going to go find, SAP or Oracle, implement that, and then that'll sort of determine what our operating model is. How would you respond to that objection or that thought?
Well, it's interesting. I had the same question asked of me yesterday from a client. It's one of those things where it's trying to help them understand where because they have challenges, they have pain points. And so the reason they're putting technology in usually is to overcome those challenges. And it's misguided in a sense because the vendors sort of say, well, yeah, technology will fix it all. But what is quite important to recognize is the reason those pain points are there is because it's more about process and how they operate. Technology is just a component of that. And so when we start talking about how we would address and overcome some of those pain points, like lack of capital, money, running out of operational expenditure, running out of those sorts of things, you start to tie it back and say, well, you could actually improve what you do just by the way you operate. And the technology is only going to support that. It's not going to be the complete answer to that. And so it's an interesting discussion because it's hard to get your head around because many people think operating model, well, I'm centralized, I'm decentralized. As many of the big consulting firms come in and believe that operating model is for you. It's, that second level is where, how are we going to operate? Now we're growing, context has changed. There's disruptors that have happened in our world. Is our operating model still the same as what it has been in the past? And that's why you need to consider those things up front because your context has changed. And so technology is only going to either enhance that or cause you some more issues.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense. So on the, I guess on that, along those lines with does the technology drive the business operating model, or does the operating model drive the technology? Is that true in most cases that you see that is best practice? Would you consider that best practice to sort of define your operating model first, or does it depend on the client, or how would you determine the right approach there?
Your operating model depends on the client and the type of industry you're in and the type of organization you are. Technology is really it should only support it and influence, the operating model should influence what technology is and how you use that technology. So to try and put technology first to actually create your operating model, and it's interesting that many people talk about best of breed or the leveraging technology best of breed. Well, that just makes me the same as everybody else. And so if I was an organization that wanted to be more competitive, a leader in my market, and I was best of breed, then I'm only as good as what technology is telling me to be. Whereas the operating model leverages how I can actually be the best I can be within my industry as such. We can do things in certain ways that give us, and I think the American version of that is what they call secret sauce. It's that competitive advantage that many people are looking to have in a really, really, it's a competitive world we're in, sort of thing. And so if we don't consider how we operate different than just having technology that is the same as everybody else's, then we're not getting any advantage. It's like when we play a sport, every team within that particular discipline actually plays a sport, but only a few are premiers or win the Super Bowl at the end, sort of thing. And so why is that the case? Is they play the game better. So their operating model is actually more refined than everybody else because they play by the same rules. The rules are actually no one plays different rules. It's just they learn how to play them better. And I suppose that's the best analogy I find with getting a very good operating model in place is look at a sporting team. There's not a lot of differences that they have apart from players and how you play the game. Not necessarily, the rules. Rules is like the technology. That's the bit that's I suppose the leveler for everyone.
Yeah, that's a great analogy and a really good point that ties it back to, success and failure rates in the industry. I mean, so many of these transformations fail largely because people are doing things out of order. They don't have the right strategy. They don't have the right approach to deploy the technology. It's usually not because the technology doesn't work or the technology is broken. It's usually because we haven't managed this whole concept of, what we want to be when we grow up and letting that dictate how we run our project versus I'm going to go buy SAP, Oracle, Microsoft Dynamics, whatever the product is, and I'm going to defer to that product and let that determine for me what processes or best practices are most appropriate for me. And I think that difference oftentimes can separate, in your analogy, the winners versus the losers in transformation, success versus failure.
Yeah, exactly right. And it's one of those things when you see organizations that are really understanding of an operating model or their place in their industry, you see the success they have and the way they actually approach things. When you look at organizations that think, I'll get the silver bullet or the magic pill or whatever, which is technology, and they get lost in it because what vendors sell people isn't actually the complete picture, because technology is only a component. It's a feeder. If you don't have processes, if you don't have understanding of how you actually are going to use those processes, if you don't have architecture that actually supports that, then you've really just got technology. That's it, which it can be limiting in the way you use it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you hit a really important point that I think is worth maybe highlighting a little bit, which is that if you're a customer, if you're a CIO or CFO or any sort of part of any organization that's about to go through a digital transformation, and you go talk to software vendors, generally they're going to tell you, if you were to present this concept to them, like, hey, we're going to define our operating model first, then we're going to bring in the technology to support that. What I've found, and I'm curious to see if you agree with this, is most of the time vendors will say, no, don't worry about the operating model. Our software has best practices, it's pre-configured for your industry, and that's just a waste of time to do that operating model stuff or that future state definition. Let our software do that for you. I mean, how do that it sounds good. I mean, it sounds like that's what I would love to hear, or I'd love that to be true, because that would make life so much easier for everyone if the technology could just sort of figure it out for us. But I found that to not be the case. What's your experience been?
Oh, exactly right. The vendors come in, and I think it's just a ploy to say, well, if I can make you feel at ease that what you're putting in is going to solve all of those problems, then you won't go and look anywhere else, or you won't actually maybe look at a different software because you realize that the software we're offering may not deliver everything that you're looking for. And I think they get a bit scared on that, and so they're very good at convincing people that, don't worry, we've got all of the answers you need, and we've actually got in our particular offering, we actually have a version that suits your industry, and it's best of breed. And that whole vision of best of breed is often overstated, because what is best of breed? As I said, is that just the leveler that everybody wants to work off? I've worked in probably thousands of businesses, and I've never seen every business work the same way. So how could best of breed work for a competitive business? So maybe a government instrumentation, sort of thing, where they're actually working, following government rules or whatever, but even they work differently across different regions, across different parts of the world, globally. So how can you have one technology platform say, I'm best of breed, and all of your problems will be solved? It's a bit hard to, when you step back, it's only when you step back you can see that. But many times when you're in the spotlight of the vendor, offering you and really sort of putting up some benchmarks, and you start looking at, the magic quadrants and those sort of things, and they sort of lead you to believe that everybody's heading towards this best of breed, when really that's just not really the case. It just means that people are actually putting in certain platforms, but they're still configuring, and they still need to configure them in a certain way that actually satisfies their business as such.
Yeah, great points. And I always try to empathize with the situation and understand the dynamics at play in any sort of situation like that. And I always look at, what if I were a software vendor sales rep? What would I be telling people, or why would a sales rep say those sorts of things? And you have to look at what their incentives are. Their incentive is to sell you on their software as quickly as possible. And if you start focusing on operating model and stuff that sort of gives you a blueprint for how to deploy technology, or if it creates any sort of doubt that technology is going to be the right answer for you, obviously I'm going to try to override that to try to sell you, like, why don't you just sign the contract now? Let's just get our software in there, and then I'll make my commission and you can go implement it. Well, I'll be happy, right? I mean, it's sort of the human dynamic or human behavior at play. And so you just have to recognize it for what it is and say, well, let's look at what's best for our business. And I think your point is really well taken too. The point about, if every system, if there were systems out there that had best of breed or best practices, whatever you want to call it, then what advantage would any organization have over another organization? So that, that's one thing. And then the other thing is, it seems like you alluded to this a little bit in your last response, but it seems like you have sort of two subsets of business processes. You have your commodity processes, like your accounts payable and GL, your period end close processes, things that they're not the same across organizations, but you could probably live with whatever technology can or can't do. Or and I'm generalizing here, but in general, those processes are more commoditized and a little bit more vanilla. But when you look at things that are more specific to your customers or your product, or if you're a engineer to order complex product, there's probably processes that are unique to you that give you some sort of edge, or that could give you some sort of edge that you want to define up front and then figure out how the technology fits. So have you seen that work before, where you sort of bifurcate or separate into two buckets, the vanilla processes, and maybe you don't spend as much time defining the operating model, and then over here with these competitive advantage or secret sauce processes, you go deeper into those areas?
Yeah, it's a good point you raised there, because it's I've probably, as you talk through that, it's like I've generalized, but there are best of breed in the sense of everybody creates an invoice, everybody creates a accounts payable process. So those sort of things you can say, well, they are standardized processes, and the more streamlined they are and the more simple they are, then that's what you're trying to get, because obviously that adds to additional transaction costs, which is internal costs within the business. But the other processes you talk about, those ones that are competitive advantage ones, they're the ones that you want to be able to have control of. So it is almost two different focuses on it. So one is the commodity type ones, your accounts payable, your finance, your traditional type things that, there is a lot of consistency and a lot of standardization in that, which I think is helpful that organizations consider that, because many organizations complicate that part of it. And so you can see where processes are very important, in the sense that if I streamline that, I actually bring more time available back in my organization to do the things I need to do for the people who are doing those roles, instead of fighting fires. But the other part is looking at, how do I actually improve processes that actually really add value to my business? And I suppose that's that secret sauce piece. So it's about understanding that both are important, and both actually add value to your business. So taking complexity out is important, but the other piece is leveraging how you go about what you do and how you do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with Crowdcast here. And I think you can see this probably on your screen, Wayne, but Saif Chowdhury made an observation. As per my experience, clients like to seek the vendor that provides pre-configured processes that can be then used as a starting point for workshops to tweak. And that's an interesting point, or an interesting question, or an interesting topic to maybe unpack a little bit. What about that concept of, hey, okay, fine, you want to, Mr. or Mrs. Client, you want to implement, or you want to define your operating model. Let's have us come in, the software vendor, system integrator. We'll come in and we'll guide those workshops based on best practice, and then you could tweak those best practices to fit your operating model, your desired future state. How does that work? Is that a good approach? Is it a watered down approach of what you're suggesting, or what do you think?
Well, I usually find it ends up being a slanted towards technology approach, because what they're trying to lead you to do is say, well, and they're very well versed in it. So if they start talking about certain processes, say, you'll need this extra piece of technology to be able to make that happen. And so it ends up being an additional aspect to the sales process, instead of saying, what do I really need? And many times you find that when you've had a vendor drive that, you end up with a lot of shelfware later, because what they actually sold you really doesn't work to actually satisfy. When you get down into the detail, you go, that doesn't work for us. Bad luck. I've already bought that, so that will sit there. And so that's one of the challenges when you have the vendor driving that, because there's no objectivity. And when you look at what they do, is they don't know your business. They have never worked in your industry. And so how would they actually have the specialist depth of how it operates to be able to make the technology work? So they really only come in from that side, is the technology side. Yeah,
I agree with that. And it seems especially true for call it the bigger ERP system. So like the SAP S/4HANAs of the world, the Oracle ERP Cloud, Microsoft Dynamics 365, those big ERP systems, generally you're more likely to run into issues or situations where the technology just doesn't do what you need it or want it to do. But in those workshops, to your point, they'll say, okay, well, let's figure out a workaround, or here's an alternative. And that's okay, but oftentimes it gets really watered down and it's just a limitation of the technology, or you're sort of boxing yourself in, you're sort of compromising what you really want and need out of your operating model when you take that approach. And maybe there's parts, like if you're doing an S/4HANA implementation, maybe there's parts of your organization that shouldn't be using S/4HANA. That's not a terrible thing to admit and say, well, maybe we shouldn't use S/4HANA for CRM. Maybe we should go use Salesforce. Maybe Salesforce is a better fit. So to your point, yeah, you don't want to get sucked into saying, okay, well, we'll just buy the whole product for across the enterprise without really knowing what our future state operating model is, because you're probably going to end up with some parts of the business that just don't function well.
Yeah, and what they tend to do is actually blindside you to actually what other options are there. So like you say, Salesforce or something else might actually be a better fit. But you will never get that if you've actually invited the vendor in to actually do those early workshops, because as far as they're concerned, there is nothing else in the world apart from their particular piece of software. And so it's not until later that you actually realize, geez, if only I'd done this. But you're with an ERP for how many years? On average, 15 years is the time you're with an ERP platform. So it's not something you're going to change straight away. You're just stuck with it, and that's a real problem, because if you're putting something in, you don't want to be something that holds you back after you've deployed. You want to be able to really get that value back out of that huge spend that you've just gone through.
Yeah, absolutely. Get that ROI that you're looking for. So a couple other comments, actually. Here's a couple things from LinkedIn here. There's one person, Jeff Weber, says operating model is the horse and technology is the cart, which that's a maybe even simpler analogy than the sports analogy you used earlier. And I like that. It's which comes first, the horse or the cart? And then a question here from Rajendra Singh Negi. I may have butchered your last name or all of your name. I apologize for that. His question is, get data about organization and processes. Tech could help, which leads to the operating model. Get technology to help. I'm not 100% sure what he's asking here, but it sounds like he's asking, or maybe making a comment, that technology supports the operating model and it helps the business model versus being driven by technology or driving the operating model. It sounds like is what he might be alluding to there.
I think one of the things there with technology determining your operating model, there are some tools out there that actually will help you actually understand how you operate as such. And so there is some technology that will help guide you with that. But it's not what your ERP platform or CRM or HCM technology is. It's you finding the gaps within it to actually guide how you should operate. So it is an informer as such if you use the technology in that way, but we're talking different technologies. And so one is a understanding and insight, and allows you to be able to monitor that you are maintaining your operating model and the procedures that sit underneath that, processes sit underneath that. So that technology is there in place. And I think it's probably becoming more mainstream as people look at that. To actually guide them on the bigger piece of their journey is the larger implementation of an ERP, a CRM, whatever that might end up being. So yes, there is some technology that can help you understand how you are operating, so give you a bit of insight. So it's just not a guess as such.